The sun had barely risen over the U.S. Army Air Base, but the usual calm of the morning was gone. Today, something serious had gone wrong, and everyone on the base could feel it. The AH-64 Apache helicopter, one of the most powerful and important machines in the fleet, wasn't working. Its engine refused to start, and no matter how hard the maintenance teams tried, it stayed silent and lifeless. Normally, the roar of helicopter engines filled the air, a sound that meant power, control, and readiness. But today, there was nothing, only silence. Soldiers and engineers gathered around the helicopter, their faces tense. Some paced back and forth, muttering under their breath, while others leaned over the engine, trying to make sense of the problem. They had all seen engine failures before, but nothing like this. It wasn't just a small glitch or a simple mechanical issue. Every system had been checked and double-checked. Every test had been run, and yet the engine refused to respond. The crew began to exchange worried glances, realizing that this wasn't going to be easy. The Apache wasn't just any helicopter. It was crucial for the upcoming mission, a dangerous operation that required precision, speed, and firepower. If the helicopter stayed grounded, it could jeopardize the mission and put lives at risk. Officers whispered to each other, calculating the consequences, feeling the weight of the responsibility on their shoulders. For them, this wasn't just about a machine, it was about soldiers on the ground who were counting on them. Engineers approached the helicopter carefully, checking connections, wires, and components. Each of them had years of experience and thought they could handle any problem, but this one seemed impossible. "It doesn't make sense," said one of the senior engineers, shaking his head. "Every system reads normal, yet the engine won't start. I've never seen anything like this." Others nodded silently, their confidence shaken. Even the most experienced hands on the base felt frustration creeping in. Every attempt to fix the engine only seemed to make the problem worse. The atmosphere grew heavy. Soldiers and technicians who were usually calm and collected started feeling anxious. Conversations slowed down, and every sound, the click of a tool, the rustle of a manual, felt louder than usual. The Apache stood there like a giant, silent sentinel, waiting for someone to unlock its secret. Time was slipping away, and the tension on the base was rising. Everyone could sense that something extraordinary would be needed to solve this problem. Some of the younger soldiers whispered rumors. "They might have to cancel the mission," one said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Maybe this Apache is done for." Others shook their heads, refusing to believe it. They had faith in the expertise of their engineers, who were considered the best in their field. But as hours passed and nothing worked, even the most optimistic began to wonder if this was truly an unsolvable problem. Meanwhile, commanders and officers watched from a distance. They didn't join the hands-on repair work, but their eyes never left the helicopter. They knew that failure wasn't an option. The mission had high stakes, and every decision they made from now on could affect hundreds of lives. The tension was so thick that even experienced soldiers felt it pressing down on them, making it hard to breathe normally. Every small sound, the hum of the generators, the flutter of papers in the wind, felt like a countdown toward disaster. Despite the growing worry, some crew members refused to give up. They tried different approaches, recalling old techniques and tricks that sometimes worked in the past. They tapped wires, adjusted valves, checked the fuel lines, and restarted systems repeatedly. Each attempt brought hope for a few moments, but it quickly faded when the engine stayed stubbornly silent. Frustration mixed with determination, creating a tense energy that crackled through the hangar like electricity. The Apache itself seemed almost alive, as if mocking everyone who tried to repair it. Its engine compartment, intricate and complex, held a secret that no one could decode. The soldiers felt a strange respect for the machine. It was powerful, dangerous, and vital, yet utterly helpless until someone figured out what was wrong. That sense of mystery added to the drama, making the morning feel like the calm before a storm. As the sun climbed higher, the base remained on edge. No one spoke much now. Everyone focused on their work, their minds racing through possibilities. Thoughts of failure, of mission delay, and even of danger to their fellow soldiers filled the air like smoke. Every second counted, and everyone felt the pressure building. The tension wasn't just technical, it was personal. Every soldier, engineer, and commander knew the responsibility they carried. This helicopter wasn't just metal and machinery. It represented lives, duty, and honor. And so, the Apache stood there, silent but imposing, surrounded by people who refused to give up. The problem seemed impossible, the tension unbearable, and the outcome uncertain. Yet, amidst the worry and doubt, a spark of determination remained. Someone somehow would have to solve this puzzle. Someone would have to bring the engine back to life. Until then, the airbase held its collective breath, waiting for the extraordinary to happen. Hours passed, and the situation with the AH-64 Apache engine grew more frustrating by the minute. The base, once a place of routine and order, had turned into a hub of tension and confusion. Engineers, maintenance crews, and soldiers continued their desperate attempts to get the engine working, but every effort ended in failure. What had started as a small technical problem was now beginning to feel like a puzzle that no one could solve. The engineers had tried everything they knew. They ran every diagnostic tool, replaced parts that could possibly fail, and even tried methods they had never used before. Some were confident at first, expecting the solution to reveal itself quickly, but as each attempt failed, their confidence began to fade. The Apache sat silently, its engine cold and stubborn, refusing to respond no matter how skilled the technicians were. It was as if the helicopter itself had a mind, deliberately resisting every effort to bring it back to life. As the morning turned into afternoon, the frustration in the air became almost physical. Voices that had once been calm now carried a sharp edge, and minor disagreements began to flare among the crew. One engineer argued that the fuel system needed a complete overhaul, while another insisted the problem was electrical. They ran tests again and again, hoping that a repeated check would reveal what they had missed. But nothing worked. Each failure was heavier than the last, weighing down the mood of everyone present. The soldiers watching nearby could sense the tension. They weren't mechanics, but they knew that the Apache was critical to the upcoming mission. Every minute the helicopter stayed grounded was another minute the mission became more dangerous. Some whispered nervously, exchanging worried glances. Others tried to focus on their own tasks, but even routine work felt overshadowed by the silent engine that refused to start. It was clear to everyone that the mission now hung by a thread, and the consequences of failure were very real. Even the most experienced engineers were beginning to question their own skills. They had faced tough technical challenges before, but nothing had prepared them for this. Some tried to step back and think logically, reviewing manuals and schematics, while others dove back into the engine, adjusting wires, tightening bolts, and testing connections. Each new theory sparked a brief hope, only to be extinguished when the engine refused to respond. With every failed attempt, the sense of urgency grew. The clock was ticking, and the Apache remained lifeless. The environment around the helicopter became almost frantic. Tools were scattered across the hangar floor, open manuals lay in disarray, and technicians moved quickly from one section of the engine to another. Some engineers consulted their colleagues, pointing at complex components and arguing over the best course of action. Others worked silently, trusting their instincts to guide them toward a solution. The air was thick with anxiety, determination, and a hint of fear. No one wanted to admit it, but the growing frustration was starting to make them doubt whether the problem could ever be solved. Rumors began to circulate among the soldiers. Some suggested the helicopter might be permanently out of service. Others whispered that the upcoming mission would have to be postponed, or worse, that they would have to carry it out without the Apache, putting countless lives at risk. These rumors only added to the tension, making everyone feel the pressure more keenly. Every second felt critical, and the uncertainty created a sense of helplessness that no one was used to feeling. Despite the mounting stress, the crew refused to give up completely. Determination burned quietly beneath their frustration. They knew that giving up was not an option. The mission depended on their success. Every failed attempt became a lesson, guiding them toward what might work next. Each engineer considered different possibilities. Could it be a rare fuel leak? A hidden electrical fault? Or perhaps a mechanical misalignment that had gone unnoticed? Their minds raced through every scenario, analyzing, recalculating, and testing. The Apache seemed almost alive, challenging them to match its complexity with their own skills. The tension was not just technical, it was emotional. Everyone at the base felt responsible. Engineers felt the weight of their expertise being tested to the limit. Soldiers felt the danger looming over their comrades in the mission. Commanders, though observing from a distance, could feel the frustration and uncertainty in the air. It was a shared experience of stress, hope, and desperation. The helicopter had become more than just a machine. It was a symbol of the stakes, a physical reminder that lives depended on what they were able to achieve. By late afternoon, the team had reached the edge of exhaustion. They had tried every conventional approach and even some unconventional ones, yet the engine remained stubbornly silent. Sweat dripped from brows, hands were blackened with grease, and minds were fatigued from hours of relentless focus. Despite this, no one left. Everyone remained, determined to crack the problem, knowing that giving up could have deadly consequences. The Apache sat in the middle of the hangar, lifeless yet commanding attention. Its silence spoke louder than words, echoing the weight of the challenge before them. The base had transformed from a place of routine to a stage of tension, frustration, and determination. Engineers and soldiers alike understood that solving this problem would require more than just training or manuals. It would require skill, insight, and perhaps a touch of ingenuity that none of them had yet brought to the table. And so, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the situation remained unresolved. The engine refused to start, the mission loomed large, and the sense of urgency pressed down on everyone present. Yet, in the midst of frustration and uncertainty, the hope remained that someone, somehow, would find the solution. The challenge was immense, the stakes higher than ever, and the clock kept ticking, each passing moment adding to the suspense of what was to come. As the sun climbed higher, the tension at the airbase only grew. The Apache remained silent, its engine cold, and the engineers' frustration had reached a boiling point. Rumors of failure swirled through the hangar, while soldiers and technicians alike began to wonder if the helicopter could ever be fixed. Just when it seemed like the situation could not become more tense, a figure appeared at the edge of the hangar. A senior commander, known for his calm authority and sharp mind. The arrival of someone with true leadership immediately shifted the atmosphere. The commander walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the helicopter and the team working around it. Unlike the others, he did not rush or panic. His experience told him that stress and confusion could cloud judgment, and he would need a clear mind to solve this crisis. Engineers paused their work as he approached, unsure how he would respond. Some expected him to criticize, others feared that he might even order them to stop and admit defeat. But he did neither. Instead, he observed quietly, letting the scene unfold before making any judgments. He crouched beside the Apache's engine, running his hand over parts as if he could feel the problem through his touch. Engineers were startled by his approach. They had been relying heavily on diagnostics, manuals, and technical tools, but the commander seemed to be looking for something different, something more intuitive. He asked a few questions, simple but precise, to understand exactly what had been tried and what had failed. His calm tone stood in contrast to the anxious energy around him. The team couldn't help but notice how he seemed almost detached from the stress, yet deeply aware of everything happening. The commander then turned to the lead engineer, who had been coordinating the repairs. "Walk me through what you've done step by step," he said. The engineer hesitated for a moment, then started explaining, listing each test, each replacement, each adjustment. The commander listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, his eyes never leaving the engine. Unlike the engineers who had been frustrated by repeated failure, he seemed curious, almost like he was piecing together a puzzle that everyone else had given up on. As the explanation continued, the commander noticed small inconsistencies and details that others had overlooked. A wire slightly out of place, a subtle vibration in a component, a reading that didn't quite match the others. These minor clues caught his attention. While the engineers had focused on broad systems, he was thinking differently. He understood that sometimes the most difficult problems were solved not by brute force or complex analysis but by careful observation and experience. He then called the team together and shared his perspective. His voice was firm but encouraging. He explained that the engine's failure was not a simple malfunction and that conventional methods alone might not work. "This requires thinking differently," he said. "Sometimes the answers aren't in the manuals. Sometimes they're in experience, intuition, and knowing who to call." His words caught the engineers off guard. They had been relying solely on their technical expertise, but now they realized that someone outside their immediate team might hold the key. The commander's calm confidence began to shift the energy in the hangar. Engineers stopped arguing and started listening. Soldiers who had been worried now felt a flicker of hope. The atmosphere changed from frustration and despair to focused anticipation. It became clear that this was not a dead end. It was a challenge that required the right approach, the right insight, and perhaps someone with a special skill. After a few minutes of discussion, the commander made a decision. He knew that continuing with the same team would only lead to more failed attempts. The engine needed someone legendary, someone whose skill had been proven in situations that seemed impossible. Without hesitation, he picked up the radio and gave a brief, decisive order. "Call the widow," he said. The words were simple, but they carried authority and urgency. Everyone in the hangar paused. No one had expected this. Who was the widow? And could she really solve a problem that had stumped the best engineers in the country? Rumors immediately started spreading. Some whispered that the widow was a retired helicopter mechanic with unmatched skill, a person whose reputation was almost mythical. Others were skeptical, thinking this was just another experiment. But the commander's expression left no room for doubt. He trusted her, and his confidence inspired others to trust her too. It was clear that the solution was no longer just about knowledge. It was about experience, intuition, and skill honed over years. While waiting for the widow's arrival, the commander remained at the helicopter, observing the work already done and asking questions about minor details. His calm presence reassured the engineers and soldiers. They realized that leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about guiding, inspiring, and knowing when to bring in the right person for the job. His decision to call the widow was not a gamble. It was a calculated move based on years of understanding human skill and machine behavior. The tension remained high, but now there was hope. Everyone understood that a turning point was near. The engine still lay silent, but the team no longer felt defeated. They had faith that the problem would be solved, and they had a renewed sense of purpose. The commander's intervention had reminded them that sometimes, when all else fails, the right person with the right experience can make the impossible possible. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the airbase was quiet but charged with anticipation. The engineers prepared to assist the widow, the soldiers stayed ready for orders, and the commander maintained a watchful eye over the helicopter. The stage was set for the next chapter, where skill, experience, and determination would meet the challenge head-on. Everyone knew that the coming hours would be critical. The mission's success depended on it, and the commander's wisdom had given them a chance that they had almost lost hope of finding. After the commander gave the decisive order, the tension at the airbase shifted. Engineers and soldiers stopped what they were doing, waiting for someone they had only heard about in whispers. Someone known as the widow. The name alone carried weight. Stories about her skill with helicopters were legendary. Some said she could fix any engine that had stumped even the most experienced technicians. Others described her as almost mystical, someone whose understanding of machines went beyond logic into instinct. Now, she was coming to see the most challenging Apache engine any of them had ever faced. Hours later, a nondescript vehicle pulled into the hangar, and from it stepped a woman in her mid-50s, carrying a worn toolbox. She moved with quiet confidence, her steps measured but determined. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, no uniform or insignia proclaiming her skill, but the air around her seemed charged. Engineers whispered among themselves as she approached the Apache, their skepticism mixed with curiosity. They had watched countless repairs fail, Yet here was someone who might succeed where all others had not. The widow did not speak much. She walked straight to the helicopter, crouched beside the engine, and began her inspection. Her hands moved with practiced ease, brushing over pipes, wires, and components as if she could feel the problem through touch alone. The engineers observed silently, impressed and slightly intimidated. She didn't consult manuals or run diagnostics at first. Instead, she seemed to rely on something deeper: intuition, experience, and a connection to the machine itself. It was almost as if the helicopter responded to her presence, as if it recognized someone who understood it. She worked quickly but carefully, examining every part that could be related to the engine failure. Unlike the engineers who had been frustrated by repeated failure, she was calm, deliberate, and focused. Every movement had purpose. Every adjustment seemed to flow naturally from years of experience. She asked only a few questions, just enough to understand what had been tried and what had failed. The team around her watched closely, learning from her precision and patience. The soldiers and engineers could see that this was no ordinary mechanic. She wasn't relying on guesswork or brute force. She was analyzing, feeling, and understanding the engine in a way that went far beyond instructions or tools. She noticed small details that had been missed by everyone else. Slight misalignments, subtle signs of wear, minor vibrations that seemed insignificant but actually held the key to the problem. Her attention to these details was meticulous, and the energy in the hangar began to shift. What had seemed impossible a few hours ago now felt solvable. Despite the pressure of the mission and the hours of failed attempts, the widow remained calm. She had faced challenges like this before, and failure was not part of her vocabulary. The engineers, who had been so stressed and exhausted, found themselves learning from her approach. She worked methodically, testing components, adjusting them slightly, and observing the results. Her hands moved confidently, as if she had done this countless times. And indeed, she had. The airbase had never seen anyone handle a helicopter engine with such grace and authority. As she worked, the commander observed from a short distance. He said little, letting her take the lead. He knew that this was her domain, and interference could slow her down. His decision to call her had been bold, but now it was paying off. Engineers watched with a mix of awe and relief as she identified areas that none of them had even considered. Her skill was not just technical. It was instinctive. She seemed to know exactly what the engine needed, almost as if she could hear the problem through the metal itself. The tension in the hangar slowly began to ease. Hope replaced frustration. Engineers whispered among themselves, realizing that the widow's arrival had changed everything. They had been stuck in a cycle of failed attempts, but now they had a guide, someone who could navigate the complexities that had seemed insurmountable. Soldiers straightened their posture, sensing that success was finally within reach. Even the Apache itself seemed to respond to her presence, as if the silence of its engine had been waiting for this moment. Hours passed as the widow continued her careful work. She adjusted, tested, and readjusted, always precise, always confident. The team around her offered assistance when asked, but mostly they observed, absorbing her methods and learning the importance of patience, focus, and intuition. The atmosphere transformed from one of desperation to anticipation. Every small movement, every twist of a wrench, brought them closer to hearing that first roar of the engine. By late afternoon, it became clear that progress was being made. The widow had identified a few critical issues and had made adjustments that no one else had considered. There was a sense of excitement building, but no one dared to celebrate too early. The engine had been stubborn for so long that any false hope could be devastating. Yet, for the first time since the problem began, everyone could see a clear path toward success. The commander remained nearby, silently approving of her work, knowing that calling the widow had been the right choice. He could see the determination in her eyes and the precision in her hands. The helicopter that had been grounded and hopelessly broken for hours now seemed almost alive again, ready to roar back to life. Everyone in the hangar held their breath, waiting for the moment when skill, experience, and patience would finally overcome the impossible. The widow worked steadily, her hands moving with skill and confidence, as she examined the Apache helicopter's engine. Every adjustment she made seemed deliberate, precise, almost instinctive. Engineers who had been frustrated for hours now watched in awe. They had tried everything, but the widow seemed to see the engine differently, as if she could understand it not just as metal and wires, but as a living, breathing machine with its own secrets. She didn't rush, yet the sense of urgency in the hangar never left her. She began testing individual components one by one. Some parts looked perfectly fine to the engineers, yet she examined them carefully, listening to subtle vibrations, feeling minute movements, and observing how everything interacted. It was a completely different approach. While the team had been focused on major systems, she focused on the small details that often made the difference between failure and success. A tiny misalignment here, a barely noticeable leak there. These were the clues she relied on. Hours into her inspection, the widow paused and studied the fuel injector system. She noticed something that no one else had. One of the injectors was slightly out of alignment. It was such a small problem that even the engineers had missed it, but to her experienced eyes, it explained everything. The engine's refusal to start, the strange readings from the diagnostics, the repeated failures, they all pointed to this small, almost invisible flaw. She smiled faintly, not because she had solved it yet, but because she had finally found the key to the puzzle. The engineers leaned in, curious and slightly skeptical. Could such a tiny issue really have caused so many hours of failure? The widow didn't answer. She simply made careful adjustments, aligning the injector perfectly and securing it as needed. She checked the surrounding components to ensure that nothing else had been affected and made minor tweaks to optimize the flow of fuel. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and precise. Each action brought the engine closer to life, and the tension in the hangar began to shift. For the first time since the crisis began, there was a sense of hope. The soldiers and engineers exchanged excited glances, realizing that the problem might finally be solved. The widow didn't announce anything or boast about her skill. She simply continued her work, testing, adjusting, and observing. She knew that success depended on careful execution and attention to detail, not haste. Every step mattered, and one wrong move could undo hours of progress. Once she had completed her adjustments, she took a deep breath and nodded slightly. Then, with a calm authority that silenced the hangar, she gave the order to start the engine. Everyone held their breath. For hours, the Apache had been stubbornly silent, and no one wanted to be disappointed again. The engineers stepped back, the soldiers watched intently, and even the commander remained quiet, knowing that this moment could change everything. The ignition sequence began, and at first, there was only a faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat. The room was silent except for the subtle hum, which gradually grew stronger. Then, with a sudden roar, the Apache engine sprang to life. The sound was powerful and commanding, filling the hangar with energy and relief. The helicopter vibrated slightly under its own strength, a reminder of the force contained within. Engineers cheered, soldiers clapped, and even the commander allowed himself a small smile. The impossible had been accomplished. The atmosphere shifted completely. What had been hours of frustration, stress, and tension turned into celebration and admiration. The engineers who had been struggling now looked at the widow with respect and awe. They realized that her skill wasn't just technical. It was a combination of experience, intuition, and a deep understanding of the machine. She had seen what no one else could see, and she had acted with confidence and precision to bring the Apache back to life. The helicopter itself seemed transformed. Once silent and lifeless, it now hummed with power, ready for the mission ahead. Its engine worked flawlessly, responding to every command with precision and strength. The soldiers felt a renewed sense of confidence. The mission, which had seemed at risk just hours earlier, was now fully on track. Lives that might have been endangered were now secure, thanks to the widow's intervention. The commander stepped forward, his expression one of quiet approval. He knew that calling the widow had been the right decision. His confidence in her skill had paid off, and the results were undeniable. The engineers, inspired by her expertise, began preparing the helicopter for the mission, following her guidance and learning from her approach. The experience had taught them that technical knowledge alone was not always enough. Sometimes, skill and intuition made all the difference. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the hangar buzzed with energy and relief. The crisis that had dominated the day was over, thanks to the widow's remarkable talent. Everyone involved had learned a valuable lesson about patience, observation, and trust in experience. The Apache was ready, the mission was back on track, and the team had been reminded that sometimes, the most complex problems could only be solved by someone with true mastery. The widow quietly packed her tools, ready to leave, her work done. She did not seek praise or recognition. She simply completed her task and moved on. Yet, her presence left a lasting impact on everyone at the base. The Apache was no longer just a machine. It was a symbol of skill, perseverance, and the difference one extraordinary person could make in a seemingly impossible situation. With the Apache engine finally roaring to life, a wave of relief swept through the airbase. The once silent hangar was now filled with energy, hope, and the unmistakable sound of power. Engineers who had been exhausted and frustrated for hours now moved with renewed purpose, double-checking systems and preparing the helicopter for the mission ahead. Soldiers, previously tense and anxious, now felt a surge of confidence. The impossible had been achieved, and the Apache was ready to take flight. The commander gave the order to begin pre-mission checks, and the crew sprang into action. Fuel levels were confirmed, weapon systems calibrated, and communications tested. The Apache, which had seemed lifeless for so long, now responded perfectly to every command. Its rotors cut through the air with strength and precision, each sound a reminder that the helicopter was once again a force to be reckoned with. The engineers watched closely, still amazed at how the widow had restored life to a machine that had defeated even the most experienced mechanics. Soldiers climbed aboard the helicopter, securing themselves and their gear for the operation. There was a palpable sense of purpose in the air. This mission was dangerous, but now, with the Apache operational, they felt a sense of security and power. The helicopter's presence would make a critical difference in the field, and everyone understood just how important the widow's work had been. Without her, the mission might have been delayed or worse, compromised entirely. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, the commander and the team observed from below, their eyes following every movement. The Apache moved smoothly, its systems performing flawlessly under the weight of its responsibilities. Engineers and soldiers alike were struck by how well the machine responded, and the relief was almost tangible. What had started as a frustrating and tense day had now transformed into a story of triumph, skill, and precision. During the mission, the Apache proved its true value. It navigated challenging terrain, providing air support and reconnaissance in areas where ground troops would have been vulnerable. Its advanced weapon systems and agility allowed the soldiers on the ground to carry out their objectives with greater confidence. The mission, which had seemed impossible without the helicopter, now unfolded successfully. The soldiers credited not just the technology, but the people who had restored it to life, the engineers, the team, and most importantly, the widow. Every maneuver the Apache made reminded the crew of the critical difference a single skillful person can make. They thought back to the hours of failure and frustration and realized that it had been worth every second. The helicopter's engine, now powerful and reliable, was more than a machine. It was a symbol of determination, expertise, and teamwork. Soldiers felt a sense of gratitude and awe for the person who had made this possible. Even though the widow herself was far from the battlefield, the mission progressed with precision. The Apache provided cover for troops, transported critical supplies, and acted as a deterrent against potential threats. This presence was both practical and psychological. Ground troops moved with more confidence knowing that the helicopter could respond instantly to any danger. The tension of earlier hours had been replaced with a sense of control and assurance. Every successful maneuver of the Apache reinforced the importance of skilled intervention, preparation, and teamwork. Back at the base, the commander watched mission updates closely. He knew that calling the widow had been the turning point. Her experience, intuition, and decisive actions had restored the helicopter to peak condition, allowing the mission to succeed. He shared reports with his team, praising the efforts of everyone involved, but his acknowledgement of the widow's role was clear. Without her, the mission might have been severely compromised, demonstrating that sometimes one extraordinary individual can change the outcome of an entire operation. Meanwhile, the engineers reflected on what they had learned from the widow. Her methods had been simple yet brilliant: patience, observation, and trust in experience. She had taught them a lesson that went beyond technical skill. Knowledge alone was not always enough. Sometimes intuition, attention to detail, and the courage to see beyond conventional methods were what made the difference between failure and success. They were inspired, realizing that their own skills could grow by adopting some of her approach in the future. As the mission concluded successfully, the Apache returned to the base. Its engine, still performing perfectly, was a testament to the widow's expertise. Soldiers disembarked with a sense of accomplishment and pride. They had faced danger, relied on their training, and witnessed firsthand how critical support systems could be when expertly maintained. The airbase buzzed with energy, relief, and gratitude. What had started as a crisis had transformed into a victory, thanks to skill, determination, and precise action. The story of the Apache's revival quickly spread through the base. Everyone remembered the tension, the hours of frustration, and the moment the widow had arrived. Her intervention had turned despair into triumph. Soldiers, engineers, and commanders all understood the value of skill, patience, and intuition. The Apache was no longer just a helicopter. It was a symbol of the extraordinary outcomes that are possible when human expertise meets critical challenges. By the end of the day, the airbase was calm again, but there was a sense of pride that lingered in the air. The mission had been completed successfully, the soldiers were safe, and the Apache stood ready for the next challenge. The events of the day had left a lasting impression. Extraordinary skill can overcome impossible odds, and sometimes, all it takes is one person to make a difference. The widow had shown that, and her legacy would be remembered long after the engine roared to life. After the mission's success, the airbase was alive with a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet celebration. Soldiers and engineers moved around, checking equipment, debriefing, and sharing stories of what had just happened. The Apache helicopter, which had been silent and lifeless just hours earlier, now stood proudly, its engine humming smoothly, ready for anything. Its revival was more than a mechanical victory. It was a symbol of determination, teamwork, and extraordinary skill. Everyone involved could feel the weight of what had been accomplished. The commander gathered the team for a brief debriefing. His eyes scanned the engineers, technicians, and soldiers who had been part of the operation. "Today, we faced a challenge that seemed impossible," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "But through focus, determination, and expertise, we overcame it. This mission was successful because of teamwork, but one person in particular changed everything." His words drew attention to the widow, whose role had been pivotal. The engineers nodded, remembering the hours of frustration before she had arrived, and how her calm, confident approach had transformed the situation. The soldiers, many of whom had watched the drama unfold from a distance, were still in awe. They had trained for months, relying on the best equipment. Yet it was the skill and intuition of one extraordinary mechanic that had ensured their safety and the mission's success. Conversations buzzed about the widow's methods, her calm demeanor, and how she had solved a problem that had stumped everyone else. The story quickly became part of base lore, an example of skill and experience triumphing where manuals, diagnostics, and even the best-trained engineers had failed. The engineers began reflecting on what they had learned. Watching the widow had been like attending a masterclass in problem-solving. She hadn't relied solely on textbooks or diagnostic tools. Instead, she trusted her instincts, her experience, and her attention to subtle details. The misaligned fuel injector, which had caused hours of frustration, was something they might never have spotted without her guidance. Her approach reminded them that technical knowledge is vital, but intuition and hands-on experience often make the difference between failure and success. As the day continued, the commander made sure that the widow's contribution was recognized. He spoke to the base leadership and the team about the importance of acknowledging skill and experience, especially when it comes to critical missions. "We all play a role in the success of our operations," he said. "But today we saw how one person's expertise can save lives and change outcomes. That is why we value those who bring not just knowledge, but mastery." His acknowledgement gave the team a renewed sense of purpose and respect for the craft. The widow herself remained quiet, packing her tools and preparing to leave. She did not seek recognition or praise. Her satisfaction came from completing the task, restoring the helicopter, and knowing that lives had been protected. To her, this was another day at work, albeit one with extraordinary stakes. She moved with the same calm precision that had defined her work throughout the day, leaving behind a team inspired and forever changed by what they had witnessed. Engineers began sharing what they had observed with their peers. They talked about how she identified subtle faults, adjusted them with precision, and relied on experience rather than just equipment readings. Lessons about patience, observation, and trusting instincts spread quickly. Young technicians who had doubted themselves earlier in the day now felt inspired. They understood that while knowledge is important, humility, observation, and respect for experience are equally critical. The widow's actions had taught them something they would remember for the rest of their careers. The soldiers who had relied on the Apache during the mission also reflected on the events. They realized that while training and preparation were vital, success often depended on the people behind the scenes, those whose work might go unnoticed but whose skill can determine the outcome of life-and-death situations. They felt gratitude for the engineers, the commander, and especially the widow, who had turned a potential disaster into a triumph. Even the commander took a moment to reflect privately. He knew that calling the widow had been the decisive action that saved the mission. It was a reminder to him that leadership is not just about giving orders, but about knowing when to rely on the right people at the right time. His confidence in her skill had not been misplaced. The mission's success reinforced the importance of trusting experience, intuition, and judgment, alongside training and technical knowledge. As the sun began to set, the base quieted down, yet a sense of pride lingered in the air. The day had started with tension, frustration, and uncertainty, but it ended with triumph, learning, and inspiration. The Apache stood ready, the soldiers were safe, and the team had witnessed something extraordinary. The story of the engine, the failed attempts, and the widow's intervention would be remembered as a lesson in skill, patience, and the power of experience. By nightfall, the base had returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of the day's events left a lasting impression. Everyone who had been involved understood that while machines and technology are powerful, it is human skill, intuition, and dedication that often determine success. The mission had been a success, the helicopter was operational, and lives had been protected, all because someone with extraordinary skill stepped in at the right moment. The legacy of that day would remain long after the engines cooled. It was a story of perseverance, teamwork, and the quiet power of mastery. The soldiers, engineers, and commanders would carry these lessons forward, inspired by the extraordinary person who had solved the impossible problem and ensured that the Apache could fulfill its mission. The next morning at the airbase, there was a quiet sense of anticipation mixed with pride. The events of the previous day had left a lasting impression on everyone. The AH-64 Apache, which had been grounded and unresponsive, now stood fully operational, a symbol of determination, expertise, and the extraordinary skill of the widow. Soldiers, engineers, and commanders alike understood that they had witnessed something exceptional, and the story of what had happened was spreading quickly across the base. Even though the widow had quietly left the day before, her impact remained everywhere. The engineers continued to work with renewed focus, inspired by her methodical approach, patience, and deep understanding of the helicopter's intricate systems. They spoke among themselves about the importance of observation, intuition, and experience, lessons they would carry for the rest of their careers. The memory of how she had carefully examined the engine, identified the subtle misalignment in the fuel injector, and brought the Apache back to life was fresh in their minds. Every detail of her work became a teaching moment, a benchmark of excellence that they would strive to emulate. The soldiers who had flown with the Apache during the mission were also deeply affected. They remembered the tension before the engine roared to life, the fear that the helicopter might remain inoperative, and the overwhelming relief when it finally worked. Their gratitude was immense, though most of it was silent, unspoken. They knew that lives had been saved, missions had been completed successfully, and their confidence in the machine had been restored, all because of someone they had never met face-to-face during the mission. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the most critical contributions are made behind the scenes, by people whose work is invisible until it makes all the difference. The commander reflected privately on the events. He realized that leadership isn't just about making decisions in the moment. It's also about knowing who to trust, recognizing expertise, and taking decisive action when conventional methods fail. Calling the widow had been a bold choice, one that others might have questioned at first, but it had proven to be the turning point in the entire operation. His respect for her skill and judgment grew even more, and he quietly ensured that her contribution was officially acknowledged in reports, though he knew she would never seek praise. Her legacy, he realized, would live on in the lessons she had imparted, the confidence she had restored, and the lives she had helped protect. At the base, the story of the widow spread beyond just those who had been present. Her reputation grew not only for her technical skill, but also for her calm, confident, and almost instinctive approach to problem-solving. Engineers and soldiers alike told newcomers about her ability to solve what seemed impossible, about how she had calmly assessed the situation, observed the details others had missed, and restored the Apache to life. She became a symbol of mastery, a reminder that knowledge alone is not enough and that intuition, experience, and confidence are just as important. The Apache itself became a symbol as well. No longer just a powerful helicopter, it represented resilience, teamwork, and the ability to overcome challenges. Soldiers treated it with renewed respect, engineers double-checked its systems with extra care, and commanders understood its importance more than ever. Every time the helicopter's engine roared, it was a reminder of what could be achieved when skill, patience, and determination combined. It wasn't just metal and fuel. It was a story of triumph, of lives saved, and of lessons learned that would echo through the base for years to come. The engineers continued their work on other machines, but they approached every challenge differently now. They remembered the widow's methodical pace, her attention to subtle details, and the way she trusted her instincts. Her influence transformed their mindset. They were no longer just technicians following manuals. They were problem solvers, observers, and learners who understood the value of experience in ways they hadn't before. The lessons of that day would shape their careers, making them better at their jobs, more patient, and more confident in the face of seemingly impossible problems. The soldiers, too, carried the lesson forward. They understood the importance of preparation, but they also understood that success often depends on people whose contributions are not immediately visible. The widow's work had enabled them to complete their mission, but it had also taught them respect for skill, patience, and dedication. In their conversations, they emphasized teamwork, the importance of supporting each other, and the recognition that extraordinary individuals can change the course of events in ways that seem almost miraculous. Even months later, the story remained a source of inspiration at the base. New soldiers and engineers were told about the day the Apache was brought back to life by someone whose skill was legendary. They were reminded that no challenge is insurmountable, that calm observation and careful action can solve problems that seem impossible, and that trusting in expertise, sometimes unconventional expertise, can make all the difference. The widow's presence had left an enduring mark, a story that would be remembered and retold for years, inspiring future generations of soldiers, engineers, and leaders alike. In the end, the Apache flew missions with unmatched reliability, the soldiers completed their objectives with confidence, and the engineers approached their work with renewed determination. The lessons of patience, skill, and intuition became part of the culture at the base. The legacy of the widow, the quiet, extraordinary woman who solved what everyone else could not, was a reminder to all that in every mission, every machine, and every challenge, there are those rare individuals whose expertise and experience can change everything. Her story, like the roar of the Apache engine, would echo long after the events of that critical day, a symbol of skill, perseverance, and the extraordinary impact one person can have.